In the mid-1980s, I always loved the early autumn evenings in Oxford Barracks in Germany, particularly at a weekend. The fog would swirl in from the nearby agricultural fields and circulate around the 1930s era National Socialist designed barrack blocks and the cobbled streets, all lit by low sodium street lighting. It was quiet and quite ethereal. Hi there, today I'm in the German city of Münster, in the southwestern corner of that city, and behind me is a large housing development known as Münster's Oxford-Quartier. But before it was a housing development, it was a Cold War British Army barracks, and even before that, a World War II National Socialist Luftwaffe barracks. So in this video, I'm going to explore the history from 1934 to 2024 of Münster's Oxford-Quartier, also known as Oxford Barracks, and also known as Hermann Goering Kaserne. Let's go, shall we? As you may have guessed from my intro, the reason I'm telling the story of Münster's Oxford-Quartier is because I was based here for 6 years with the British Army in the mid-1980s. And here I am, pictured looking very smart in around 1988, against the backdrop of Oxford Barracks' famous sandstone wall. So as well as being a history video, it's going to be a bit autobiographical. Where in the world then are we today? So we're in the city of Münster, in the North Rhine-Westphalia region of Germany. That's about 30 miles east of the Dutch border. Münster today is an independent city within Germany, a Kreisfreie Stadt, with over 300,000 residents. It is a university city with over 60,000 students. It is considered the cultural capital of North Rhine-Westphalia and is analogous to possibly Cambridge in the United Kingdom, or indeed a smaller version of Boston in the United States. Münster's origins can be traced back to the 7th century AD, where a Catholic monastery was founded over a crossing over the River Aar, from which a marketplace and eventually a market town began to develop. By the Middle Ages, 1300 AD, Münster had become a fortified city and a Catholic stronghold, featuring two prominent churches, St Lambert's and St Paul's Cathedral, both in the centre of the city ramparts. Even today, Münster is considered one of the staunchest Catholic cities in Germany. One of the unique features of the city, and quite dominant in the present day, is the artificial lake known as the Aarsee, created by damming the River Aar and then hollowing out an artificial lake basin. The project was started in the year 1888, delayed because of World War I, and finally completed in the year 1934. At the northern end of the Aarsee is Münster's Altstadt, its old town, and its medieval streets and lanes, including the cloistered and cobblestone Prinzipalmarkt. This is the Prinzipalmarkt, or Principal Market, today. It is a reconstruction, because as we'll find out later in the video, most of Münster's Altstadt did not survive World War II. It is from the picturesque point of view of the Prinzipalmarkt that I want to take us back in time, back in history, to the period where our story begins, the mid-1930s. And this is how the Prinzipalmarkt looked back then. Initially a political irritation to the people of Münster in the early 1930s, but by 1934 the National Socialist Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, NSDAP, or as you know it, the Nazis, had become a dominant force in German politics. Their leader, Adolf Hitler, that year had declared himself Chancellor of all Germany.
Am 30. Januar dieses Jahres wurde die neue Regierung der Nationalkonzentration gebildet.
Adolf Hitler and his Nazi government's invasion of neighbouring Poland in 1939 would spark off World War II in Europe and lead to the German state's virtual destruction. 40 years later, here I am back in the Prinzipalmarkt in 1986, looking about 12 years old. Yeah, please don't laugh. That was the fashion back then if you were in the army in the 1980s. In that year, I remember, and the reason I put this picture here, is I was introduced to my German girlfriend's grandmother. Trying to find common ground and not to talk about anything controversial, very quickly the grandmother mentioned the war. She told me that Hitler never liked the people of Münster. Hitler, she said, distrusted us. He disliked us. Nobody here supported the Nazis. They were forced upon us. For what I understand from historical fact that this is largely true. Hitler despised Catholics, and much of the Nazi leadership likewise were anti-Catholic. Therefore, the strictly Catholic people of Münster were not considered good Germans. The city of Münster's reputation as antagonistic towards National Socialism in Hitler's and his leadership's eyes was further reinforced by the constant criticism from the pulpit by the Bishop of Münster, Clemens August Graf von Galen. Having consolidated his power, from 1935 onwards, Hitler, in direct contravention of the Versailles Treaty signed at the end of World War I, began a wholesale rearmament of the German state. Because principally of its reputation as a problematic and potentially rebellious city, but also because of its strategic location close to the western German border, Münster was chosen to become a major garrison for the new strengthened Wehrmacht. From mid-1935 onwards, as well as the 3 existing Imperial Army German barracks within Münster's city limits, 5 external satellite locations were chosen to become new military installations. The first of these, Barracks 1, Kaserne 1, was to be built on farmland on the major road between Münster city and the village of Roxel, called Roxellerstrasse, in the village of Gievenbeck. Built in 1936, Kaserne 1, Barracks 1, was built to the exacting standards dictated to by the National Socialist General Building Inspector, Albert Speer, who was an architect by trade. He was empowered by Hitler for the construction of an infrastructure to support the so-called 1,000-year Reich. So all new builds under the Nazis were built in a very sturdy brick construction, quarried stone style. In a pretense of compliance with the Versailles Treaty, when intended and constructed, the Nazis declared to the world that this was a barracks for a transport regiment. This, of course, was a lie. And the first unit to occupy Kaserne 1, Barracks 1, on Roxellerstrasse, was Luftwaffe Flak Regiment 34. Flak Regiment 34 was founded from the old Flak Regiment 9, but it was further reinforced and provided with a very versatile 88 anti-aircraft gun. In 1937, they were further reinforced with the provision of a searchlight company and tasked at the start of World War II with the air defence of the Northwest Rhine air sector. Life at the Gievenbeck barracks would have been really good for the Luftwaffe conscripts with state-of-the-art facilities. And also, in common with other new-build National Socialist barracks, the High Command encouraged postcards to be created so that recruits could send home to their families how good a life they had in the armed forces. In 1937, the drab, boring and utility name of Kaserne 1, Barracks 1 was dropped. For some time, the locals had nicknamed it Gievenbeck Barracks or the Flak Barracks. But at the end of 1937, it was officially renamed Hermann Goering Kaserne, Hermann Goering Barracks. Hermann Goering was at the time, and since 1935, Chief of the Luftwaffe High Command. In 1940, he was awarded the honorary rank of Reichsmarschall. This was the second most senior politician in Hitler's cabinet, and he had been a key ally to Hitler since the inception of the Nazi Party, even being wounded in Hitler's 1923 Beer Hall Putsch. Göring had been a World War I fighter ace and traded on that legacy and reputation for the next 2 decades. In the early years of National Socialist government, Göring had been Hitler's right-hand man. Hitler seemingly oblivious to Göring's very many character defects. Göring by the late 1930s was obese. He was addicted to morphine, and he was an out-and-right kleptocrat. He stole from the state to enrich himself. By 1945, Hitler had come to despise Göring, and in the last days of World War II, before his suicide, Hitler had stripped him of all power and ordered his arrest. To save his skin, Göring surrendered to the Allies in Bavaria, believing naively that he would be installed as a puppet chancellor of post-war Germany. Instead, the Allies arrested him on the spot. He was put on trial at Nuremberg and sentenced to death for war crimes. Göring had been sentenced to be hanged on the 16th of October 1946. However, the night before, he killed himself by swallowing cyanide in a capsule smuggled in by a sympathiser. Despite being largely blameless for the rise of National Socialism, Münster City paid a very heavy price for World War II. As a key strategic target, by 1945, 80% of the city had been levelled by aerial bombing. Over 700 civilians were killed in one single raid alone. And by 1945, only 25 families still lived within the city limits, the remainder having evacuated to the countryside. Surprisingly, given the devastation to Münster City, due to its rural location in the village of Gievenbeck, 2 miles from Münster, Hermann Goering Kaserne survived Allied bombing completely intact. There had been near misses, but no bombs actually scored a hit within the barracks perimeter. The end of the war came mercifully quickly for the people of Münster, and without many casualties. On the 29th of March 1945, with the fall of the town of Dülmen to the west, the last remnants of Wehrmacht evacuated Hermann Goering Kaserne for the defensive positions in the rubble of Münster city itself. This allowed the people of Gievenbeck to loot the barracks, principally looking for food and clothing, as at this point in the war the civilian supply chain had largely collapsed. On the 1st of April 1945, the Allied forces, in the form of the UK's 6th Guards Tank Brigade, supported by the US 113th Parachute Infantry Regiment, arrived in the area of the villages of Roxel and Albachton, facing east towards the city of Münster against sporadic Wehrmacht resistance. Their intention was to assault and capture Münster city the next day. Early in the morning of the 2nd of April, Hermann Goering Kaserne was captured intact, but the Allies held off the main assault on Münster until 10:30 hours to allow Wehrmacht surrenders and withdrawals. Therefore, by nightfall of the 2nd of April 1945, Münster city was in Allied hands with very few casualties on either side. Until the end of the war in May 1945, the British used Hermann Goering Kaserne as a military command post and district headquarters, and then, after the war until 1949, as the centre for the occupation of the city of Münster. Early in mid-1945, as part of the denazification of Germany, very quickly the British renamed Hermann Goering Kaserne Oxford Barracks. As legend goes, the brigadier who was based there believed that Münster resembled Oxford, the city of Oxford in England, where he went to university. This naming convention set a trend in Münster, as other British barracks were similarly named, such as York, Portsmouth, Lincoln Barracks, etc. In 1949, the state of West Germany was formed, the German Federal Republic, and the occupation, at least in the west of the German state, was over. But not the threat of another major war, and this time from the east, from the Soviet Union. And thus began in 1950 onwards a Cold War, a military standoff between the Eastern and Western superpowers, with its potential battlefield in Central Europe, i.e. Germany. The British Army remaining in Germany was re-rolled and renamed as the British Army of the Rhine, BAOR. The threat from the Soviets would be real, present and dangerous for the next 40 years.
For many years, tension has existed in Europe between the forces of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And it is in West Germany that any future attack might well be launched. The threat comes, of course, from the Soviet-controlled East, and nobody in the free world can predict when, or indeed if, an attack will come.
The British Army of the Rhine would go on to form one BR Corps, one British Corps, of NATO's Northern Army Group, responsible for defending West Germany from Bielefeld in the west up to the inner German border at Brunswick. As it was in World War II, the city of Münster found itself strategically located, for the Cold War in the forward communication zone of 1BR Corps and Northern Army Group. Over the next 40 years, during the 60s, 70s and 80s, Oxford Barracks was modernised and expanded into neighbouring farmland to include armoured vehicle hangars and maintenance areas. By the mid-1980s, it was one of the most modern military facilities in the British Army. For brevity's sake, because equipment and personnel changed dramatically over the post-war years, I'm going to concentrate on just my time in Oxford Barracks during the mid-1980s to explain what was behind the walls. When I started in Oxford at the end of 1985, it housed a mechanised infantry battalion, which in time of war would be combined with Challenger 1 main battle tanks from Gremendorf to form an armoured battle group, part of 4 Armoured Brigade, the 3rd Armoured Division of the British Army. In 1986, we took delivery of the British Army's new Warrior Mechanised Infantry combat vehicle and re-rolled to become BOR's first Armoured Infantry battle group. This schematic shows the personnel and vehicles you would have found in Oxford Barracks from 1986 onwards. The mainstay of the Armoured Infantry Battalion was the Warrior Mechanised Infantry Combat Vehicle, which was state-of-the-art in 1986. Essentially, it's a high-speed armoured personnel carrier, with 7 dismounts accommodated in the back, and a vehicle crew of 3, driver, gunner and commander, armed with a 30mm cannon and 7.62mm chain gun. The former workhorse of the mechanised infantry, the Fighting Vehicle 432, the FV432, remained in service after the inception of Warrior, and we used it in other roles. This old reliable could carry up to 10 soldiers. It was only armed though with a 7.62 pistol-mounted machine gun. At its heyday in BOR, 2,500 of these vehicles were in service with the British Army. Another old faithful of mid-1980s BOR was the Bedford 4-ton truck, nicknamed the 4-tonner, and this was used for logistics by A1 and A2 echelon. In total, in the mid-1980s, Oxford Barracks housed around 600 British soldiers and over 175 armoured and soft-skinned vehicles. Unfortunately, when we deployed, this made us very noisy neighbours to the people of Münster. Duty life at Oxford Barracks consisted principally of vehicle maintenance and low-level training, some sport and regular, no-notice deployments into the field called Exercise Active Edge. Usually once a year there was a major divisional or brigade-sized field training exercise that lasted about a month. And yes, we really did drive across German farmland, something unthinkable in today's climate. Away from the military side of the Cold War, politicians on both sides of the divide made various speeches, something nobody really paid much attention to at the time.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
As Ronald Reagan made his now famous speech in West Berlin in 1987, those of us from Oxford Barracks had deployed on Exercise Certain Strike 87 or Exercise Reforger. I've made a separate video on that exercise, link in the top right hand corner. Then suddenly, at the end of 1989, after 40 years of military standoff, the Cold War Iron Curtain collapsed.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, Die Mauer muss weg, the wall must go.
The wall did go, and with it, the entire East German government by the end of 1989. By 1990, Germany was reunified for the first time since the end of World War II. By 1990, the Cold War was effectively over. And by 1991, with the unexpected complete collapse of the Soviet Union, it was complete. The end of this Cold War was supposed to make the world a safer place. It did not. With the conflict between the superpowers at an end, regional powers took the opportunity to flex their military muscles, starting with the Ba'athist Iraq regime under dictator Saddam Hussein. In 1990, Saddam Hussein's Soviet-equipped military, the largest military in the Middle East, invaded neighbouring oil-rich Kuwait. With Saudi Arabia and 60% of the world's oil supply under threat, the United States and a coalition of nations prepared a military response. The two largest contributors to the military force to liberate Kuwait were obviously the United States with 470,000 troops, and then the UK providing nearly 60,000, most deployed from Germany, from the now virtually redundant BAOR. We provided the 1st UK Armoured Division, comprising of the 7th Armoured Brigade from Soltau Faribostal and the 4th Armoured Brigade from Münster.
In the Gulf, hundreds of British troops continue to pour in each day. It's the biggest build-up of military hardware since the Second World War.
By October 1990, 7th Armoured Brigade had left Germany for Saudi Arabia. Cameras greeted the arrival of Challenger tanks. This was to be the first big televised conflict. The Desert Rats would be joined by a 2nd British Army of the Rhine Brigade. War never fought against the Russians was about to be played out in Iraq. Tanks, now specially adapted for the desert dust, trained for weeks.
In early 1991, the Gulf War, as the liberation of Kuwait became known, went hot, with an air campaign and then a ground invasion, which lasted less than 100 hours. In the end, Iraq's army was virtually annihilated, leaving 100,000 Iraqis dead versus less than 1,000 coalition casualties. It is somewhat ironic, after 40 years of practising for war against the Soviet Union, that the equipment and the training and battle skills of the British Army built up in West Germany on the training exercise areas of Soltau and Fallingbostel would finally be put to use 1,000 miles away in the Middle Eastern desert against a Soviet-equipped Iraqi army. Is it wrong to consider a war where 100,000 people lost their lives the highlight of my military career? Possibly, but that's how I see it unapologetically. I was a Sergeant Armoured Infantry Section Commander in the Gulf War with 4 Armoured Brigade, Britain's Desert Rats. And this is me on Objective Steel, Day 2 of the ground war in Iraq. As quickly as we deployed to the Middle East, we were back. By summer 1991, we were out of Iraq and Kuwait and back in Oxford Barracks in Münster. But then, very sadly, my time in Germany after 6 years was up, and I was rotated back to the United Kingdom. Our replacements in Oxford Barracks in 1992, the 1st Battalion Coldstream Guards, had little time to settle in before they had to get to grips with another regional conflict, also caused in part by the collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse and civil war in the now former Yugoslavia. If the Iraq War was a far-away war, then the civil war in the former Yugoslavia was very much a conflict in mainland Europe for the first time since the end of World War II. It would occupy the British Army of the Rhine for most of the 1990s. But behind the scenes, the politicians were plotting. It had been decided to cut the British Army significantly due to the end of the Cold War, so the politicians could cash in on what was called a peace dividend to spend money elsewhere in the economy. Under a programme called Option for Change, by 1994, BAOR would be cut by 50% and renamed British Forces Germany. There would be widespread redundancies and many units would be disbanded. For the next 15 years, BFG, British Forces in Germany, carried on but in managed decline. But when the end came, it came suddenly, unannounced and brutally.
You're watching SSVC Television. Now it's time for the main evening news.
British forces and civilians have today been absorbing the implications of the government's decision to completely pull out of Germany by 2020. It poses numerous questions for soldiers and their families as a complete military community that's been in place since the end of the Second World War is dismantled over the next decade. Our chief reporter in Germany, Martha Fairley, has been gauging the initial reactions.
Well, the speed with which the British forces will be leaving Germany has taken many by surprise. As you can imagine, the story is front page news in the German press today. And
due principally in response to the global financial crisis of 2010, but also due to the cost overruns of conducting two costly and unpopular military campaigns in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan, the British government again took the easy option of cutting the armed forces, this time by completely cutting British Forces Germany and relocating what was left back into mainland United Kingdom. The end as a barracks for the British Army at Oxford Barracks didn't need to wait till 2020. It came much earlier than that, in 2013, just 3 years after the government's announcement. The Battalion 1 Yorks would be the last unit in Oxford Barracks, and in their last month, the city of Münster awarded them the freedom of the city as a farewell gift.
Time to say goodbye, hieß es gestern für über 700 britische Soldaten und deren Familienmitglieder. Der Abzug der britischen Streitkräfte aus der Domstadt ist gleichzeitig auch das Ende einer 70 Jahre langen Ära in der Münsteraner Stadtgeschichte. Und dieser Abschied wurde mit zahlreichen Bürgern in Münsters guter Stube gefeiert.
Es hat sich ja schon abgezeichnet in den letzten Jahren, dass dieser Tag näher kommen würde. Es ist schon etwas komisch, weil die britischen Familien gehörten mit zu unserem Stadtbild, mit vielen Veranstaltungen, mit Zeremonien, aber eben auch mit den Begegnungen, die vor Ort stattgefunden haben, bis hin zu British Tea Parties und anderen Dingen. Das war schon etwas ganz Besonderes. Und dieses Stück geht zu Ende. Andererseits erleben wir natürlich auch, dass es eine neue Geschichte gibt zwischen Briten und Deutschen, aber auch vor allen Dingen zwischen Münsteranern und Yorker Bürgerinnen und Bürgern, nämlich unserer Partnerstadt. Und das entwickelt sich sehr, sehr gut. Ich freue mich auch, dass die Lord Mayor, die Bürgermeisterin aus York, auch hier heute zugegen ist.
Since its capture during World War II, 20 major British Army units have called Oxford Barracks home over the previous 75 years. After the farewell parade with 1 Yorks in the Principal marked, the British Army very quietly left Oxford Barracks, and the keys were returned to the federal government of Germany. For the first time since 1936, Oxford Barracks had no military personnel behind its walls. Something I didn't appreciate when I lived there was how much of a mystery the inner workings of Oxford Barracks was to the average Münster citizen. So it was no surprise that when the city of Münster conducted an open day in late 2013, it was very heavily attended by inquisitive Münster citizens, over 500 in total. The open day in 2013 had another purpose. It was the start of the public consultation as to what to do with the now redundant Oxford Barracks. The German army, the Bundeswehr, had already indicated they had no use for the redundant British barracks, and the federal government were inclined to return control of the barracks to the city of Münster. With the British gone less than a year, the federal government found a use for Oxford Barracks because in early 2014, Germany was suffering from not a military crisis, but a civil one. In common with most of Europe, there was mass immigration and mass movement of people from the Third World into Europe.
Kamen zum Höhepunkt der sogenannten Flüchtlingskrise 2015 1,1 Millionen Menschen nach Deutschland. Rund 29% von ihnen waren aus Syrien geflohen, 14% kamen aus Afghanistan.
Many EU countries took efforts to prevent mass immigration by refugees or illegal immigrants, whichever side of the argument you wish to stand on. Germany, under Chancellor Angela Merkel, adopted an open door policy.
Und das Motiv, in dem wir an diese Dinge herangehen, muss sein, wir haben so vieles geschafft, wir schaffen das. Wir schaffen das und wo uns etwas im Wege steht, muss es...
By 2016, Germany had received over 1 million asylum seekers, and they had to go somewhere. So the Office of Migration and Refugees requisitioned Oxford Barracks to be used as a registration and accommodation centre for migrants. At the same time, the University of Münster was renting some of the barrack blocks to be used as overspill accommodation for students at a very cheap rental rate. Apparently, both the asylum seekers and the students absolutely hated living in Oxford Barracks. This is ironic because we British soldiers considered living in Oxford Barracks one of the most luxurious barracks we'd ever stayed in during our service. Oxford's role as a refugee migrant camp was quite short-lived, as it had already been agreed to return Oxford Barracks from federal control to the city of Münster for redevelopment. In 2018 that transition took place, and Münster City created the special purpose development company called Convoy GmbH. to redevelop Oxford Barracks and York Barracks on the other side of the city. Convoy being an abbreviation of Conversion, Oxford and York. Oxford Barracks, over the next decade, was to be redeveloped into an urban quarter of the Gievenbeck suburb of Münster, to be known as Oxford-Quartier, retaining the historic British name of the barracks. Convoy's role was to oversee the overarching planning of the quarter for the city, with separate developers developing their own projects with their own finance. This was complicated by the fact that most of the 1936 buildings in Oxford Barracks had historical listed status. Most of the post-war British constructed buildings, the vehicle hangars and more modern buildings, could be demolished as they weren't listed. And so in 2020, the demolition crews arrived and started to remove the non-listed buildings in Oxford Barracks. Although sadly the historic cobbled streets of Oxford Barracks were removed and replaced by tarmac, the iconic sandstone perimeter wall was to be retained largely intact. One of the first projects to be complete was the conversion of the old officers' mess, the officers' casino in German. This was sold to the University Hospital and was to be converted into conference facilities, offices and temporary accommodation. This is a drone flight of the old officers' mess after the British left, and this is what it looked like inside in the 1980s.
The Guards, perhaps to the irritation of other regiments, exude an effortless superiority that survives the apparently proletarian ill manners of eating with their hats on. It dates from the days of drafty messes, and they see no reason to take them off.
Still visible on the external wall is the Luftwaffe Flak Division emblem from World War II, the archer firing into the sky, with the credo in German, Furchtlos und treu, fearless and loyal, with the date in Roman numerals 1936. The finished renovation in 2024 is absolutely impressive, and the University Hospital Annex building certainly looks like a new build, although it's hard to forget that it is a historic building. When I visited in 2024, the city of Münster was upgrading the sewers along Strasse. But the renovation of the former Oxford Barracks guardroom was fully underway. You can see it covered in scaffolding on the right here. Hopefully the entrance to the Oxford Quarter will look a lot nicer when it's finished. But what is at the entrance is a very interesting piece of history, an artefact from the National Socialist era, a National Socialist Reichsadler. The Reichsadler is located on the forward-facing wall of what was once the battalion headquarters building, and when it was a British barracks, we kept this covered up with an Oxford Barracks sign to comply with German law, but also not to offend the local population. If you look at a 1930s photograph, you can see the Reichsadler very clearly on the wall of the initial building, also with the signage of Hermann Goering Kaserne from about 1937 onwards. And in the 1980s, you can see how the British covered it up with an enormous Oxford Barracks sign in Guards blue, red, blue. To be honest, back in the 1980s, we knew there was a Reichsadler hidden under the Oxford Barracks sign, but I don't think the German civil population did. You have to remember that post-denazification, the German Federal Republic made it illegal to display any Nazi imagery or symbols. So when the British left in 2013 and we took our sign with us, what was behind it was a bit of a revelation in the local Münster press. Although when you look closely, you can see that the Nazi symbols have clearly been removed, probably within days of the barracks capture in April 1945. So actually, we British need not have covered it over for 70 years. Also indulge me here while I'm a bit of a Dr. Mark Felton pedant for a minute. This is a Reichsadler. It is the symbol of the National Socialist government. Serving under a Reichsadler did not make one a Nazi. It was forced on all government departments and the armed forces. If you're a Nazi, then you displayed the Party Adler. And if you look at the symbol, it looks different in that the feathers are much more square and stylised, and also the head faces to the right, not the left. This was used for obviously the Nazi Party itself, but also its paramilitary, the Schutzstaffel, the SS as you know it, and other Nazi functions. What is interesting, and to be even more pedantic, is that because this was a Luftwaffe Flak Regiment barracks in 1936, why they didn't just use the Luftwaffe Eagle as opposed to the Reichsadler. Luftwaffe Eagle is an eagle in flight carrying a swastika. My guess is that because under the Versailles Treaty this was supposed to be just a transport regiment barracks, they decided to keep the subterfuge by just using the Reichsadler. As World War II and the Nazi era of Germany fades out of living memory, present-day Germans are much less sensitive about the displays of the National Socialist past. It is now considered historical. And for that reason, the Reichsadler is going to remain in place in the new Oxford-Quartier development as a talking point and a reminder of history. And exactly as intended by the developers, this photograph is of members of Kerbelbox, the Gievenbeck Residents Association, on a history walk, probably discussing the same matters about the Reichsadler as we've just discussed in this video. Looking through the main entrance, you can see on the right the Barracks guard room. This housed the 24/7 Barracks security team of about 25 soldiers in my day on a 24-hour duty. It also housed the regimental prison for naughty soldiers. Back in the 80s, this is how the main gate area of Oxford Barracks looked. This is footage of 1988, where No. 3 Company of my battalion invited relatives out from the United Kingdom to visit their soldier sons on duty in Oxford Barracks. This is a drone flight from Stadt Münster showing the barracks pre-demolition, and on the right is what we called the cookhouse. Some armies call it a canteen, but it was the barracks restaurant. And also the historic steps on the right were a favourite for unit photographs. These steps were intended as a style feature for the barracks in the 1936 ornate style. Looking a bit sorry for itself now, and the curb and cobblestones have gone, but this is where we took most of our team photographs. This is how it looked in 1986, where 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards Support Company, we had our company photograph here. And of course, there's yours truly, hidden away in the back there. From the main entrance, the drone flight continues over Oxford's enormous Barrack Square, which was constructed with the intention of mustering military equipment for deployment into the field. When I visited in 2024, the construction teams were busy ripping up the Barrack Square tarmac, and what it's designed to become, I'll discuss in a minute. But back in the 1980s, being a Guards battalion, we found a much more important use for such a large square. In Guards battalions, every Monday morning at 8 o'clock, there would be a battalion form-up and roll call, where the whole battalion would parade on the square. There would be an inspection, and petty punishments would be handed out, usually to infractors. Every year, there would be 3 weeks of drill known as spring drills, and this is what you'll see now in this video. It was, in fairness, quite a miserable time, but it was just one of the things you had to put up with being in the Guards battalion, and you just got on with it, and then it was over for a year. In the background here you can see the Oxford Barracks gymnasium, and in this photo where we're having a smoke break, a bit clearer. As you can see from this conceptual drawing, Convoy's concept now is to build on much of Oxford Square, but also to retain a sort of town square aesthetic, including a water fountain. And you can see the water fountain here in front of the historic gymnasium building. The overall 2030 concept is for a series of urban courtyards of either new build accommodation or conversion of the historic listed 1930s barrack blocks into flats. Each zone will have its own urban garden and there will be central facilities. One of those would be the conversion of the former NAFI building. The clock tower building was Oxford Barracks Junior Ranks Club, called simply by the British the NAFI, standing for Navy Army Air Force Institute. Social activity in the Army has always been segregated by rank, and this meant that the commissioned officers had their mess, which we've already seen elsewhere in the video. The sergeants and warrant officers had a separate mess, and junior ranks, that's corporal and below, had the naffy. During my battalion's time in Oxford Barracks, we also had a sort of speakeasy bar in the basement of the cookhouse called the Nirac Bar, named after an officer murdered by the IRA in Northern Ireland. This was the only place that all ranks could mingle, and even then, that was kind of frowned upon. The naffy bar could be quite a violent place, particularly at a weekend, and there was seldom not a fight on a Saturday night in the naffy bar. The Clock Tower building, the naffy as it was once known, is to be redeveloped as is, and is going to become a sort of association building for the Oxford Quarter. Administrative offices, a creche and a community cafe. Albert Speer's barrack blocks have stood the test of time. Maybe not 1,000 years that Hitler envisaged, but they are sturdy and still good to go 70 years later. And I think most 1980s soldiers agree that the 1930s era designed barrack blocks in Germany for BOR was the best accommodation that we ever had. Because you had large, wide corridors, spacious bedrooms and plenty of communal facilities such as day rooms. The accommodation plan in 1980s Oxford Barracks was thus. Officers and sergeants got a room to themselves. Junior non-commissioned officers, corporals, shared a two-man room with each other. And guardsmen, i.e. private soldiers, depending on their seniority and length of service, either got a 6-man, a 4-man or 2-man room. The senior guardsman, the senior private soldier of each company, was given the privilege of a room to himself. As well as the Junior Ranks Club naffy, there was also a naffy supermarket on Oxford Barracks located near the rear gate to the barracks, intended mainly for families living on Arnhem Weg. Unlike American bases and American PXs, the naffies tended to sell all German produce, not imported British produce, and did a roaring trade in Hereford pills, the so-called yellow handbag. Although it was technically forbidden to have alcohol in a single accommodation, it was widely ignored. So popular was Hereford pills and the yellow handbag with the British Armed Forces that after options for change in the mid-1990s, the Hereford brewery took a 25% drop in sales. During the 1980s, Oxford Barracks had football pitches, squash courts and tennis courts. All of these are getting removed. But the gymnasium created for the Luftwaffe in 1936 is a listed building, and that is to be refurbished and retained as a community sports centre for the Oxford Quarter. And finally, on our tour of Oxford Barracks, we're going to take a look at the perimeter road, where was located all of the vehicle parks for each company, vehicle hangars, i.e. vehicle sheds, and where we stored our armoured vehicles during the Cold War. Obviously now, all the armoured vehicles have gone, and these vehicle hangars are going to be demolished and replaced by new build accommodation as part of the Oxford Quarter. On my visit in 2024, it did make me feel a bit sad to watch all these vehicle hangars coming down, where I spent many hundreds of hours working on my armoured vehicle. But when you look at the conceptual art of what Convoy has intended for the redevelopment of the Oxford Quarter, the character of the old barrack blocks is being retained along new 21st century new builds, and it looks impressive. Not only for historical reasons is Oxford Barracks famous. Twice in the past 2 decades it has been used as a set for TV dramas. Firstly, in the mid-1990s for the absolutely god-awful army soap opera for ITV, Soldier Soldier, which followed the lives of soldiers in a fictitious army unit, the King's Own Fusiliers. In Series 2, the regiment is posted to Oxford Barracks in Münster. The series was terrible. It was made mainly for female viewers, packed full of clichés and wooden acting. Misguidedly, the army provided access to Oxford Barracks and military equipment because they thought it would be good PR for the army, right in the middle of the Options for Change redundancy programme. It was an image of the army as imagined by civilian screenwriters and lovey actors. A better effort in 2024 was an episode of the long-running German ZDF series Wilsberg. For my non-German viewers, think of Wilsberg as a sort of Murder, She Wrote, a tongue-in-cheek detective series. with Leonid Lansing in the Angela Lansbury role as a full-time Münster antiques dealer and part-time private detective. The 2024 episode, A Detective and a Gentleman, sees Vilsberg investigating a historic murder in mid-1980s Oxford Barracks of a taxi driver. With the redevelopment of Oxford Barracks, secrets are unearthed, and as ever, things are not as they seem.
Mit dem Finanzbeamten, das ist disgusting.
Ja, wir beide verstehen uns blind. Wir sind ein eingespieltes Team, was man von uns beiden nicht behaupten kann.
Wo führen Sie uns denn hin? Vorwärts jetzt da!
Oxford Barracks also appears in print. Münster historian Alfred Crook has forensically researched the history of Oxford Barracks for the book The History of a Münster Barracks. It's 170 pages long and goes vastly into more detail than I ever could hope to in this video. It is available only in German language at present, and you can find this book through Google. Alfred's book is so detailed and accurate that a copy of it has been placed in the archive of the UK National Army Museum as the official history of Oxford Barracks. Well, we're now at the end of my very long 45-minute history of the Oxford Quarter. Thank you so much for staying with me to the end. If you enjoyed it, please consider a like and a subscribe as ever on YouTube. But my visit in 2024 is not the end of the story. Oxford Quarter building programme will not be complete until 2030. So, I'll be back in 6 years to see the finished product. I'll be in my 60s by then. And when I come back, all the new housing units in the urban village will be occupied by Generation Z Germans and their kids. Hopefully this video and Alfred Crook's book will provide anybody that's interested with a grounding on the history of their new urban village, and a reminder that between 1936 and 1991, Münster was a very different place.
Any larger call signs ever.